Alright, in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to go over our first program that actually requires us to force the computer to make decisions on our behalf, calculate our grade given different inputs for variable values for homeworks and test exams. So we're going to do this two different ways. One, we're going to use JavaScript windows, so using the prompt and alert methods, prompt to receive input and alerts to provide it back to the user. And then challenge 2, we're going to actually do the same thing but using the HTML DOM, and you'll start to see why the majority of people like to use web pages, because it's a whole lot easier to interact with than a whole bunch of pop-ups for prompts and alerts. So challenge number 1 is we're going to do a course grade program. This is a simple one, like at the end of a course, and we're going to say there's only 3 categories for calculating your grade: homework points, midterm points, final exam. Maximum homework points are going to be 30. So this is going to be out of 100. It's going to make our calculations easier, but you can do it however you want. So 0 to 30 are your homework point range. For the midterm and the final, they're both worth up to 35 points. So if you add 30 plus 35 plus 35, you get 100. So we're using kind of like the standard A, B, C, D, E, F grade, not E, but the A, B, C, D, F grades. It's going to use JavaScript prompts to get the input, alerts to provide the answer, and you're going to make sure your program works. In this one, this particular challenge, you're not going to write distinct modules and methods to do anything like validate user input. That's not required. We're just going to do is one main program, and then when we get to challenge 2, we're going to have some functions. Okay, so the basic steps in this program are: you're going to ask the user inputs. We're going to have 3 separate inputs just for the homework, midterm, and the final points. Then we can, from that point, calculate your overall points for the course. Then we have to ask the user what your grading option is. Are you doing pass-fail, which you need greater than an 80 to have a 80 greater than or equal to 80 for a passing grade, and anything less than 80 is a fail, or you're going to use the standard grading option, which is A, B, C, D, F. And then you're going to post your files to your web server and make sure it runs. So this is a depiction of one way to solve this particular problem. This is a flow chart. It goes through the basic steps that I just talked about in terms of declaring variables, get your inputs, do your calculation, and then using nested if statements, go through and figure out, what your final output grade is, and then you're going to output what I call string final grade, because in this particular case we're going to have either pass, fail, or A, B, C, D, F. So if you going back to here, if you go down into the notes on this, and I'll do this shortly, I wrote a very simple pseudocode based on this chart, and I didn't go into great detail on the pseudocode for the nested if-else statements. I will show you that when I type the code out. Now we are going to write compound conditional statements in JavaScript. In other words, we're going to have the complete condition for, in this example it's on the screen. We want to make sure that everyone is aware that to get a B, what are the conditions? Well, to get a B, my total points have to be greater than or equal to 80 and 2 ampersands. This is the logic formula, Boolean logic formula for the end condition where both sides have to be true. So we have to have our total points greater than or equal to 80 and less than 90. So why I do this, and has been pointed out in class discussions and a textbook and stuff, you don't have to have the entire compound conditional if this if statement is nested inside of another one that asked if the total points were 90 or greater. The reason I want you to get into the habit of doing this is I want this if statement right there to be sufficiently clear and stand on its own, regardless of the code that comes before it or after it, that if I'm going to get a final grade of a B, what are the conditions that meet it, and I don't have to go read a section of code that who knows how long it is just to try to figure out what other conditions have to be met in order to get a B. So there you go. And challenge 2, we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to use HTML DOM. I have a URL here that that you'll go to copy the HTML file, the CSS, and a JavaScript starter file. But basically what you're going to be doing in challenge 2 is taking your JavaScript that you wrote in Challenge 1, changing the input methods because you're going to be pulling from the DOM, from text blocks on the DOM, and then your output is going to be pushing out to a text box on the DOM. So what I'm going to do in this is I'm going to write the code out for the HTML and the JavaScript for Challenge 1, which is the prompts and alerts. Then I'm going to go to the web page and I'm going to cheat and steal kind of like the guts of the program that has the if then else statements, and I'm going to replace that, and it's going to work out just fine, because really all you're doing different in Challenge 1 and Challenge 2 is taking your input and output from JavaScript prompts and alerts and instead using the DOM. So on that, let's go to our editor. Actually, before we go to the editor, I want to go back to the slide in the PowerPoint deck that has the flowchart. And down below, what I did was I created a bunch of pseudocode that represents what we have on here. So it's declaring the variables, get the user input for determined grade, calculate your total points, which is the sum of the homework and exam points, get user input whether it's pass or fail or letter grade. If the grade option is audit, evaluate total score based on 80% for pass fail, else determine the letter grade based on typical ABC. Now that if else makes a big difference because we're going to nest our decisions in there, and you will see how we're going to do that in the code. And also, this is a great problem for this type of problem, is an excellent one to replace the nested if else statements with a switch statement, which we will learn shortly in the future. And then my output string final grade. Now if you notice, for my pseudocode here, I wrote it with 2 forward slashes, which is one of your character sets for you to use comments in JavaScript. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to bring up my editor, and I'm going to start from scratch. So as usual, I'm going to create a new template. I'm going to create an HTML5, and put a page title in that provides some indication of what your program is. This is mainly an issue when you have a lot of tabs open in a browser. You'd like to know what the particular application in that browser tab is doing. So if you leave it blank, then that's kind of sketchy. Now we definitely need a script file that's going to point to our JavaScript file, and you're going to have to name this. So probably names it something like homework 4, and you can do challenge 1, or I think I'll just do homework 4A because there's 2 challenges, and HTML. Actually, that's a mistake. I will need to change that because this file I'm writing is HTML. I'll just have to go back and fix that, but first let me get my header in there. And I'm just going to put a header in to show that after the JavaScript has executed and we've gone to the part of the HTML, remember that sequence part of the structure theorem, that we can see that something has happened instead of just a blank screen. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file as hw4a.html, and then I am going to have to go back into my HTML and change that source script file to a JavaScript. Now I need a new JavaScript file. Go ahead, create a new template, and just like we do with all the other JavaScript files, make sure we save it to our desktop, at least before we transfer it. Now I pasted in the pseudocode from the PowerPoint, and because I named my variables properly in the pseudocode, I can just go ahead and copy and paste those in. That works out really well. But at least now I can just look at the pseudocode and start going through it and not have to worry about figuring out what I'm going to do, because I already have a plan. So now I'm going to get my float homework points, and I'm going to do this the same way we always do when we're doing JavaScript prompts. Is first I'm going to force type it to whatever I want if it's a number, and then I'm going to come up with a prompt that is reasonable enough that the user will know what to do. In this particular case, asking them to enter homework points from 0 to 30 points, and when you add up the homework points, the midterm points, and the final point should be 100. I'm going to do the same thing for the midterm and the final. Always force type your numeric inputs, because JavaScript does weird things sometimes to variable values, changing it back to text. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to do math on text if we can avoid it. And again, put clear enough guidance in the prompts for the users so that they won't make mistakes. Now we're going to do input validation in a future exercise. We'll do input validation for this very program. It'll be quite simple once you get used to learning how to use loops. understanding what is a good and bad input. So once we're done with the pulling the user input in, then we're going to follow it down in our algorithm, which is our pseudocode, and calculate the float total points. And again, at this point of the program, do you really need to force type the float total points calculation? Probably not. But I like to be better safe than sorry. I don't want to have to troubleshoot what happened if I change something in the code in front of float total points later, like if I do a to-fix to try to reduce the number of decimal points. I don't want that to be a problem. So I'm going to force type it. Now for the grade option, next line in the pseudocode, I'm doing an integer. I decided to do a 1 or a 2 for choosing whether you're doing pass, fail, or letter grade. There's so many ways to do this, and when we get to the web page, we're also going to do a 1 or 2, but later in the class we're going to do something else. And what you see here for the prompt is I'm doing a backslash with a double quote because I want to prompt my user to enter either 1 for pass, fail, or 2 for letter grade. Now I put these backslashes in, and if you notice that the color of the text hasn't changed yet, what that backslash does is an escape character would allow me to put a character that would otherwise be viewed by the interpreter, the editor, to be a quotation mark to end a string. Instead it allows me to use it inside the string. We're going to go over this more in class, but I wanted to make sure that I had double quotation marks around the 1 and the 2, and that's how you do it. Again, we'll have more practice on this much later. Now what the next thing we do is really the guts of the program is we start asking a question. If you chose 1, that means you want to be evaluated as pass or fail based on 80%. Now if you notice the if statement, it says int grade option equals 1. That is the syntax for checking the equivalence of int grade option being equal to 1. Now if it is 1, we have to ask the question, are the total points greater than or equal to 80? And if they are, then your final grade is going to be pass, else your final grade is going to be a fail. So notice how we are nesting the float total points greater than or equal to 80 inside the int grade option 1 that automatically indents the text, and it's a good visual representation that we have a nested set of statements that matter. Now after we're done with the int grade option, now we get into what is the primary part of the program for the letter grade. Now we are actually nesting the if-else's for the letter grade just like we did the float total points. We didn't have to put int grade option equal 2 because if we validate our information properly, which we didn't do in this program but will in the future, then there'll only be a 1 or 2 option the way we're writing this program. Now basically all I'm going to do is replicate what I've done for the int grade option, except I'm going to keep nesting my decisions for greater than or equal to 90, between 80 and 90, and so on. Now discussed in the PowerPoint slides just recently, I am going to do compound conditional statements for my B, C, D grades, and I don't have to worry about it for F, and you'll see why. And I'm doing the compound conditional statements again because I don't want to have to rely on me reading the code before it to understand what condition is necessary for my final grade to be a B. Now you can very well write this program without the float total points less than 90, because the previous if statement has accounted for that. But again, let's do this as proper as we can up front, and we have a much better chance of not making a mistake later. And now I'm going to continue my nested if-else statements, starting at, hey, is it greater than or equal to 90? If it's not, is it between 80 and 90? If it's not, is it between 70 and 80? If it's not, between 60 and 70. And then finally, when we get to the point where it's not between 60 and 70, at this point it can only be less than 60. We don't have to validate that it's between 0 and less than 60. We will know at that point that anything less than 60 has to be an F, and we don't have to put an if statement. That's the last else. Now you'll notice I have the curly brace brackets on a line after the if statement, and this is not a standard convention in most programming languages, but I do it in JavaScript because it doesn't provide any errors. In other words, it doesn't cause a syntax error, and it makes it incredibly clear on where the block of text associated with a statement starts and ends. So if you count all the open curly braces, you'll have the same number of closed curly braces, and when I format the text this way, I can always visually check to see if there's a close and enter. Now the last thing, if you go back up to your, well, let's save this first. And remember, we're going to save it as HW4A.JavaScript in the same directory, the desktop, as our HTML. And last thing we have to do is, following through on our algorithm, go to outputting the final grade. And this is very simple because we're using JavaScript alert statements. We're just going to type an alert and say your final grade is, and then we're going to invoke whatever value is in string final grade. And again, the logic that's in those nested if else statements is what determined the person's grade based upon the user input. So that's the first program. It's actually pretty simple once you get to understand how nested if else works. And well, it's about time to test it. So good thing there's no errors. That's wonderful. Go ahead and preview. I'm going to preview in Firefox just because we have Firebug available to us. And oh, I gotta drag over my Firefox, sorry. And go ahead and put some values in. And here we're going to see why it's a pain in the butt to use JavaScript prompts for multiple entries. So we're going to test our program. Let's put in a value of 20 for homework points, and 20 for midterm, and 20 for final. So that should be 60%, which would be a fail for pass fail, or a D in letter grade. Type in 1 for, and it goes, oh look, your final grade is a fail. Okay, so I want to retest it. I'm going to put some numbers in here. I'm going to go with 20 again. I will go with 35 and 35. So now I have a 90. So I press a 1 and I'll have a pass. Now I have to do this for every possible test scenario. So A through F, and pass or fail for everything for 79 below and 80 above. And it's really kind of annoying to do that, those test cases with this kind of, JavaScript prompt thing. So that's why we're going to use the HTML DOM. It's really going to make our life a lot easier. So first things first, we have to go to the web page that I provided you, and download the HTML that's provided, the CSS that's provided, and the starter JavaScript that comes with it. So go to the web page, do the standard right click, view page source, and we're going to copy and then go to our Komodo edit and create HTML files as appropriate, and probably name them something unique like, I don't know, HW4B.html, HW4B CSS, and HW4B JavaScript, because I'm not very original at this moment. Now those are not very descriptive names for this particular class. That's fine because I can easily tell what it is. But if you're going to write a program that people are going to use, you're probably going to want names that make a little more sense. Now in the CSS, I could have left it any name I wanted. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to just go with the convention of HW4B for everything, just to make our lives a little easier. And since we know the names, I'm going to make sure that the links for the CSS and the script are done. Create a new template, and I'm going to go to CSS because that's what I'm going to create. Now what I'm going to do is show you the other way, which is probably the better way of doing it, but I keep forgetting. So here you can actually name it when you create the new file, hw4b.css, and you can choose the directory to be the desktop. And actually this is definitely the better way to do it, but to be honest with you, Control-T and then I start typing and I forget, but then I make sure I save it to the desktop. You can do it either way, it's completely up to you. So just standard, go to your CSS file, copy it. You're going to paste it into your CSS file, make sure you save it, and then do the same thing with the JavaScript from your HTML source coming out of the web page on Firefox. Yep, make your JavaScript file, it's a blank one, go down to your web page, and you backspace, in this particular case will get you back to the HTML, copy it, paste it, and we are ready to roll in terms of editing our JavaScript program for challenge number 2. Now, the calculate click function that you see on lines 6 through 13 is actually our main program. We understand the $sign function and the Windows onload. We're going to use those all the time in our web apps. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of everything in the calculate click function I've seeded. Make sure you save this file, of course, and make sure it's saved to the desktop where your other directory, or the directory where you have all your other files in. And the point of this program isn't to recreate everything. I just want to change the input and the output. So I'm going to go ahead and literally go back to my homework 4a JavaScript, copy it, and paste it into my calculate click function. Now when I do that, get rid of the extra spaces on the bottom I put just for making it easier to see in the editor. Make sure you indent the code, because all of this code I just pasted is a block of code associated with the calculate click function, and having that visual indicator of that indent will help tremendously in trying to figure out what code is associated with what set of statements. Now we're using the same guts of the decision in this particular program. So we're using the same nested if-else statements. All we're really changing is the inputs and the outputs. So let's just go ahead and delete the inputs one at a time and fix them. So here we want to get homework points. So what are we going to do? Use the $, go to the DOM, look for the HTML ID we need, and if you don't know what that is, click on the HTML, and I made a pretty easy standard HW_points, mid, final, grade option, final grade. So relatively easy in this particular case, but verify you have it right. So I go $, to go to the DOM, go to the HTML ID I want, and look for its dot value. Now, because this comes in as text in JavaScript, I'm going to parse float, so I'm going to force type it as a float. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for float midterm points and float final points. Force type it, and then do my standard $, which is go to the DOM, HTML ID for what I want, the dot value, and then I go on to the next variable. So homework points, midterm points, final points, we'll have that all taken care of here in a second. The final input we're going to need is the int grade option, and HTML gives you even more and easier ways for the user to use grade option. We're going to stick with the 1 and the 2 just for this program, because when we get to our methods and functions and we like to create a lot of buttons, we can easily write this program that has the user enters the input values and then clicks a button for pass fail, or clicks a different button for a letter grade. Now for int grade option, I'm going to do the exact same thing, except I'm going to use parse int instead of parse float, because it's going to be either a 1 or a 0. And again, $, go to the DOM, in double quotes wherever the HTML ID is for that text block that you're using, and then you're going to get the dot value. And I still can't type the word value very nicely. So because I haven't changed any of the variable names, I don't have to change any of the nested if-else statements. I just have to go to the output. I'm going to get rid of the alert statement, and now I'm going to go, I want to go to the DOM, so $, wherever the HTML ID is for the text block, which is final grade. That's that blocked out text block on the front page. I'm going to set that value equals string final grade. Save it, and all my errors are gone. So I've used all my variables. I really didn't change any of the structure of the nested if-else statements. Now it's time to test our program, and we will see how much easier it is for us to go through all of our test cases for all the possible values and make sure it works. So go ahead and type in something to test our audit. So we're going to do again 2020-20, type 1, we better fail. If our program's to work, hey, great, okay. Wonderful. Now let's change the points to maybe 80, which is just the cutoff for passing. And look, it passed. Well, let's check to make sure 79 fails. And yep, it fails. And that's the kind of thing that you're going to want to do for all of your conditions in your code. Now I type in 2 for letter grade. That's a C. That's a, for 79. Change it to 89. I get a B. Wonderful. My program works. You will want to do this for every single condition. That's about it. Aloha.